I'm Ian Wardropper, Director of the Frick Collection. Delighted to see you all here. It's my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Marsden, Director of the Royal Collection and Surveyor of the Queen's Works of Art since 2010. Before that, beginning in 1996, he was responsible for the supervision of applied arts, or we tend to call them more often decorative arts here, in all of the British royal palaces. I first got to know Jonathan through the French Bronze Study Group, which he helped to found some 15 years ago. As he is above all a sculpture specialist and is writing a catalog of European sculpture in the Royal Collection, he became frustrated, as many of us were, by the lack of firm understanding of French bronzes. So he actually set out to do something about it, organizing and forming this group of scholars, collectors, dealers with knowledge in the field, which he persuaded to travel around the world to view, study, and debate the great collections of French bronzes in places like his own collection in Windsor, but also in England, in Dresden, Paris, St. Petersburg, New York. And not only did he succeed in organizing this disparate group and preventing them from yelling at one another with his infinite tact, but he's very gifted in synthesizing what is being said and making sense out of it. So this decade-plus long project led to an exhibition that was called Cast in Bronze, French Sculpture from the Renaissance to Revolution, which was held at the Louvre and at the Metropolitan Museum in 2009. None of this would have happened without his dedication to the project, and it's the most substantial publication on the subject to date. Jonathan, of course, wrote extensively for that volume and has published a number of articles on French and Italian bronzes. He's helped to organize such exhibitions as Victorian Albert, Art and Love in 1910. He's written guides on important houses in England, including Clarence House, Cliveden, Claydon, as well as Buckingham Palace. And as the director of the Royal Collection is now organizing a number of really interesting shows that will, I think, put a new light on the Queen's collection in the future, that range from Castiglione, that will, this wonderful 17th century draftsman painter, that will be placed alongside an exhibition of contemporary works on paper, organized partly by the Royal Academy, that will be a fascinating juxtaposition to this great 17th century draftsman, and he's doing things like fashion in Tudor and is it Elizabethan and Tudor paintings. So I think we will expect a very lively program at the Queen's Gallery in the future. He's lecturing to us as part of a series on Renaissance art that's been generously supported by the Robert H. Smith Family Foundation. Robert Smith was a great collector of Renaissance bronzes, most of which have ended up in the National Gallery in Washington. And so the subject of the talk tonight is very appropriate as a Smith Foundation speech. We've started to film and to stream live the lectures that are presented here on our website when the speakers are as gracious as they have been tonight as to allow us to do so. And so this will be archived, and we found has reached many people. The first lecture in the series has been viewed by as many as 5,000 people, for example. So this has become a great resource for us and for those who are interested in the history of art. Jonathan Marsden is speaking today on a subject related to a work in the Frick collection, Jean-Luc's bronze bust of the Duke of Alba. The Duke commissioned one of the greatest portraitists in bronze, Leone Leoni, to make what's really in many ways an unparalleled set of 3 bronze busts. The title of the lecture tonight is Portrait as Trophy, 3 Imperial Busts by Leone Leoni. John?
Well, thank you, Ian. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I feel very honored to have been asked to come and speak this evening here at the Frick, and I thank Ian for the invitation and also Denise Allen for the idea in the first place, I think. I'm going to speak about 3 works of art which I think would have appealed greatly to Henry Clay Frick, and which of course I hope will also appeal to you. They normally live in the state apartments at Windsor Castle, but a little over a year ago, the Queen very kindly agreed for them to be transported to South Kensington to be placed on display in the medieval and Renaissance galleries at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where they have made a substantial impression. The intention of the loan, and indeed my lecture this evening, is that these three great works of art should become as famous as they deserve to be. At the V&A, they can be seen in ideal conditions, surrounded by contemporary works of art from all over Hapsburg Europe. In the more widely varied context of the state apartments at Windsor, it's just possible that some out of what is now more than 1 million visitors every year have in recent years not quite noticed these great things, and that simply will not do, not only because of their quality, but because of the people they represent. As they passed through Europe, these three men, the Emperor Charles V, his son Philip II, and their chief military commander and, if you like, Secretary of State, the Duke of Alba, had what I once heard a United States diplomat describe as a heavy footprint. The state visit of Charles V to England in May and June of 1522, when the emperor was seeking Henry VIII's support in his war against France, was one of the grandest in the long and continuing history of that tradition. The centerpiece was the Feast of Corpus Christi, celebrated by the two men at Windsor, which resulted in a treaty of alliance against the French. The emperor brought just under 2,000 people with him, including the Duke of Alba, and 1,100 horses. He was greeted on his journey from Dover to Greenwich by Cardinal Wolsey, 2 dukes, 9 earls, 8 bishops and abbots, 17 barons and 17 knights, and a series of wine depots was established at 10 locations between Dover and Windsor, rather as Arctic explorers established fuel dumps along their route. And lodgings were commandeered throughout London for the vast retinue. These were men who, when they arrived somewhere, they wanted to be noticed. There was much about the way that Charles and Philip saw the role of king and emperor that they took straight from the traditions of the ancient Roman Empire, and nothing more so than the concept of the triumphal entry, here epitomized by Andrea Mantegna in his cycle of the triumphs of Caesar, which can be seen at Hampton Court Palace. And when Charles's son Philip landed at Southampton on a rainy day in July 1554 on his way to marry Mary Tudor at Winchester, he was accompanied by 6,000 men. In the first year of the marriage, Philip, and indeed the Duke of Alba, lived in England. If you look carefully at the bust, you'll see that the sculptor has included a very particular inscription. Now, this cannot have been used before July 1554, and it's highly unlikely that anyone would have called themselves King of England, etc., after the events of the winter of 1555-6, when his father Charles renounced so many other titles in his favor. A far more common style would be something like this, or that. So that cast inscription has the great advantage of pinpointing the date of the 3 busts, and I do mean all 3, for a reason I shall mention fairly shortly. Well, in my talk this evening, I'd like to look at these 3 bronze portraits in some detail and to ask a couple of questions. Why do they look the way they do? What are the ingredients? I'd like to begin with an attempt to understand what the 3 who are portrayed, Charles, Philip, and the Duke of Alba, might have intended these images to convey. But then I thought it might be interesting to turn the tables a little. I'd like to suggest that the way the busts are regarded, the response of us as the viewer, has been a function of both time and place. It has changed not only thanks to the passage of 450 years, but it's also depended on the setting, the place in which they've been displayed, whether that be a ducal castle in Spain, a royal castle in Berkshire, or indeed a major art museum in South Kensington. And this is the topic which gave rise to my title, Portrait as Trophy. If the inscription cast into the base of Philip's bust provides one invaluable piece of information about its origins, there is another extremely helpful early record. Because in Vasari's Life of Leone Leoni, published in the second edition of 1568, we read that the sculptor made for the Duke of Alba his own portrait and those of Charles V and Philip. It was Anthony Radcliffe, whose name is famous here as one of the authors of that exemplary catalogue of sculpture, and to whom anyone working on bronze sculpture owes so much, who in 1969 first suggested that the three busts at Windsor might be those mentioned by Vasari, a hypothesis that was then expanded upon in print somewhat later by Ulrich Middletorf. Further positive evidence for the identification comes from a description of the Duke of Alba's castle of Alba de Tormes near Salamanca, where they're described in 1788 as standing in the castle's gallery. In this description by Antonio Ponce, the bust of Philip is noted as representing him as King of England. Further confirmation, I think, that the busts he described are indeed those we're talking about today. Well, knowing that the commission came from the Duke of Alba, we might examine what he was doing and where in 1554 or thereabouts. Well, he was in Milan as Captain General of the Imperial forces, effectively the Emperor's viceroy for the government of the Italian realms, which of course included not only the strategically important and populous state of Milan, but also the kingdom of the two Sicilies, that's to say, Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia. Why is it interesting that the Duke of Alba was in Milan? Because Milan is where Leone Leoni had his studio, and it was also one of the leading, some would say the leading, European centre for the production of armour. Two of the busts, those of Philip and the Duke of Alba, have been shown in South Kensington before. They featured in that extraordinary enterprise, the Special Loan Exhibition of 1862, which was a parallel exhibition to the International Exhibition, also held there, the first and, as it turned out, the only result of the original intention to hold an exhibition every 10 years following 1851. But since then, all three busts have travelled across Europe, almost to the extent of the historical figures they represent, to exhibitions in Spain and Germany and the Netherlands. Let's take a rather closer look at these wonderful things, beginning by introducing the sitters, which I shall do one by one. We better start with the Emperor. Charles was born in Ghent, the eldest son of Philip the Handsome, Duke of Burgundy, and by his marriage to Joanna of Castile, the first Hapsburg king of Castile. Charles succeeded his father as ruler of the Burgundian Netherlands, aged only 6, and at 16 he became co-ruler with his mother of Spain. He was in fact the first king of the combined kingdom of Spain. When he was 19, he succeeded his grandfather Maximilian as Holy Roman Emperor and Archduke of Austria. So it was under Charles that this vast inheritance, the combined inheritances of Burgundy, Hapsburg, Castile, and Aragon, were amalgamated, and to these were added the new Spanish dominions overseas, and Charles's motto, plus ultra, can be found emblazoned on buildings and works of art throughout Habsburg Europe. It is a succinct expression of his imperial ambition to extend his own empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Charles spent much of his adult life fighting wars, and Titian's great image shows somebody who actually did lead his troops into battle, rather than merely wanting to be thought of as having done so. His enemies were the Protestant princes of Germany and, of course, the Kingdom of France, with which he fought determinedly over the dominance of Italy. I want to introduce a theme here to which I will return, which has to do with religion and power. If your plan was to dominate Europe, it was best to do it in the name of God. And that is why these taglines are adopted by the various simultaneous European champions. I'm not a follower of heavyweight boxing, but I believe it's possible to have 3 or so simultaneous world champions, according to which regulatory body, is it the WBO or the WBC, has awarded the title. And so you had His Most Catholic Majesty, His Most Christian Majesty, and, as it were, in the blue corner, Defender of the Faith. The year 1547, in which the great victory was won at Mühlberg, and for which is commemorated by Titian's picture, was also the year in which these two, Francis I and Henry VIII, both died. So it could be said that Charles was never more powerful than he was at the end of 1547, the undisputed world champion, European champion. Charles's image was in the hands of the 2 most outstanding Italian portrait artists of the time, 2 close friends, Titian and Leone Leoni, which has been good for his memory, given that he actually looked like this. You could call them court artists, but it's important to understand that Charles's court was emphatically not in one place. It moved to the various centers of the vast empire. He underwent numerous coronations and made innumerable joyeuses entrées. Leone's correspondence with the emperor was often concerned with delays in sending finished works of art, for instance, from Milan to Brussels. Now, over a few months in the winter of 1555-6, Charles successively abandoned all those titles, passing the Hapsburg ones to his younger brother Ferdinand, and the Spanish ones with Spain, the Netherlands, and the overseas territories to his son Philip. So let's now turn to Philip. He was born in Valladolid in Spain, the son of Charles V and his wife Isabella of Portugal. Philip grew up in the Netherlands, and as we've seen, he married as his second wife, Queen Mary, the first daughter of Henry VIII, and that was in 1554, and in that year he was given by his father the crown of Naples, so that he would not only be a consort, but a consort of equal rank. He wouldn't just be married to a queen, he would be able to call himself a king. And he succeeded to the crown of Spain in 1556, when he also acquired 17 titles in respect of the Spanish Netherlands. Philip, like his father, was often portrayed in armor, as here by Rubens in a copy of a picture by Titian commemorating the Battle of Saint-Quentin in northern France in 1557. Although Philip's forces won that battle, he did not lead them. Indeed, he only arrived the next day, and he was not, in his father's image, a muscular or fighting-fit individual. Quite the contrary. It was, though, this victory on the Feast of St. Lawrence that determined Philip to build what would become his great obsession, the great monastery palace of El Escorial, designed in the shape of St. Lawrence's gridiron, but modeled also on the biblical description of the Temple of Solomon, a palace, incidentally, on whose embellishment the Leonis would have much work. But the guiding principle of Philip's life was what has been termed a messianic vision. He was driven in everything he did by what he understood as the will of God. For Ferdinando Alvarez de Toledo, 3rd Duke of Alba, who served both father and son from the Battle of Pavia in 1525 until his death in 1582, this could make life difficult. Alba was from a well-established noble family, succeeding to the dukedom in 1531. He was, first and foremost, throughout his life, a soldier, and by far and away the most famous Spanish military leader of the 16th century. He collected much of the credit for the defeat of the Protestant League at Mühlberg, and this propelled him to the top of the imperial service. And in the following year, he was appointed High Steward of the household of Prince Philip, for whom Alba became not only a strategist and commander, but in some ways a mentor. Alba, as we've heard, came to England with the Infante Philip in 1554 and later deputized for the king at Philip's proxy marriage to Elizabeth of Valois in Paris in 1559. Alba was given to rather uncompromising language, declaring, for example, that it was better to lay waste a country than to leave it in the hands of heretics. It seems appropriate to me that his bronze face in the bust is so heavily scarred. Of course, these scars are not those he suffered himself, but those which his effigy has subsequently suffered. So that's who we're dealing with. And now you know a little about them, which of course many of you already did, the busts somehow seem a little bit more threatening, don't they? Let's now look at the portraits, bearing in mind they were commissioned not by Charles or Philip, but by the Duke. What are the things that he meant them to convey? Well, first, it is striking that there is no apparent distinction in rank. These men were not equals at all, but that is how an innocent eye sees them. If you asked a child to pick out which one was the emperor or which one the king, they would have nothing on which to base their answer. The three men are united very closely by their uniform. They're all apparently wearing the very same armor. They're all wearing the Hapsburg insignia of the Order of the Golden Fleece, and they all have on their breastplates oval reliefs with Christian imagery. Well, the use of armor in portraiture has given rise to a vast literature. Most of the period in which this sort of armor was worn for practical purposes predates the rise of portraiture itself, and by the time of the Renaissance, the wearing of armor of this kind was in decline as guns and artillery changed the rules of warfare. But the medieval art of chivalry, if you like, the ideal of the knight in shining armor, persisted strongly as a courtly concern, and to use English examples, tournaments were an important part of the court culture of Henry VIII and of Queen Elizabeth, and Henry, Prince of Wales, the elder son of King James I, recently celebrated in a beautiful exhibition in London, was a devotee and accomplished practitioner of all the arts of chivalry, and this is one of the beautiful armors made for him at Greenwich. His younger brother Charles was clearly intent on projecting himself in the same knightly guise. So art historians wonder, does the wearing of armor in a portrait symbolize masculinity, power, military valor, or belligerence? A common mistake in the literature of interpretation is to distinguish between the armor in a portrait, which is taken to symbolize, say, military might, and the other trappings of opulence, such as a crown or a rich canopy. Actually, the armor was almost always the most costly thing in one of these portraits. So one of the reasons someone might have chosen to wear armor in a portrait was actually to display their wealth as much as their might. Leone made a number of portraits in bronze and marble of Charles V, all of them based on sittings which the emperor gave him in Brussels in 1549. Writing about the bust of Charles in Vienna, which was made for the emperor's chancellor, Cardinal Granvella, and completed in 1555, John Pope Hennessy, another name to conjure with here, called it a kind of hieratic reliquary bust, composed of an ideal head and a related allegory beneath. Well, he certainly captured the strangeness of this image. And recalling the portrait we saw of Charles a moment ago as a younger man, this is certainly an ideal head. But I'm not sure that reliquary is quite right. After all, the portrait is not posthumous. It was made for the sitter himself, and however religious the emperor was, he was no saint. Now, the sorts of armor that one sees in portraits falls broadly into 4 categories. The first 2 are the same as the categories of armor itself. They were either made for practical use in warfare or the tournament, and that's what we're dealing with here, or they were what were called parade armors, sort of thing that Charles and Philip would wear for their triumphal entries, in which they clothed themselves as a sort of portable sculpture gallery, wearing what are really great works of art rather than practical pieces of equipment. The 2 remaining types of armor have more to do with art. One sees a number of portraits in which people are portrayed wearing Roman armor, portrayed with greater or lesser accuracy. A great example being the bust of Cosimo de' Medici by Cellini in the Bargello. This was not something that Cosimo went around wearing. It's an artistic convention intended to convey certain things about him. Well, finally, the final category, in this late 16th century bust of the Elector of Bavaria, Wilhelm V, we have our 4th category, something that can never have actually existed at all. It's the fantasy of the artist, even though it includes several motifs that were favored by armorers such as the Negroli. It never can have existed. There is about our busts a delightful materialistic joke. Painters like Titian and Antonis More made armor out of paint. Leoni made armor out of metal, and armor is made from metal. More specifically, though, armor is made from steel. Even the most elaborate sculptural armors were formed from plates of steel that were hammered from the reverse to make the raised decoration. The surface patterns were made by etching and coloring by patination and gilding. None of these techniques were used by Leoni to make his armors. Indeed, nobody would want an armor made of bronze. Why not? Because bronze is both too heavy and at the same time too soft. Yet Leoni's armors are extremely convincing. Everything is completely understood and realistically rendered. It would not have been difficult for him to obtain real armors of this kind from his fellow Milanese craftsmen, and painstakingly to make his wax models, carving the incised decoration into the wax. Leoni was undoubtedly very interested in the armorer's art, and also, it seems, in the essential paradox of armor. And I show you his unparalleled masterpiece, Charles V Defeating the Fury, completed in 1551-3, in both its versions. They're the same object, but with the armor removed as it was intended to be. This is the paradox put so well recently by Caroline Springer in her book Armor and Masculinity in the Italian Renaissance. All armor, she writes, is simultaneously an affirmation of power and an admission of vulnerability. But the point I'm making, quite simply, is that Leoni seems to have thought more about armor than any other portrait artist of his time. Sometimes artists can be shown to have portrayed a specific, significant armor. There was a magnificent exhibition a few years ago at the Prado and in Washington which dealt with just this subject. And it seems that where a specific armor is shown, it was to commemorate a special, famous event. So the armor portrayed here by Leoni and by Titian is that which was made for him in Augsburg and was worn at the Battle of Mühlberg in 1547, when he decisively defeated the Protestant armies of Germany, and the armor itself survives in the Royal Armories in Madrid. But the armor depicted in our portraits is not recognizable, although it includes some motifs which we can find on other surviving examples. And some similarities with the Negroli helmet. I think this is the one in Cambridge. So we've established that all three men are wearing the same armor. Each one is ornamented with a central mask, a Medusa mask, a common device with its origins in antiquity. But each one is also
wearing, in a perfectly conventional way, the collar and pendant badge of the Order of the Golden Fleece. So the three of them are united by membership of the Hapsburg order. Below the badge of the order, we find on each of the busts an oval relief or plaquette. This doesn't seem to be meant to be part of the armour, but an independent work of art. That's how they look, and I think it would be exceedingly hard to make one of these by embossing steel. However, although Leone's first craft was as a medalist and die cutter and maker of small reliefs, nobody seems to have come across one of these. At the same time, nobody seems to have come across an armour with such a thing. So here we have perhaps an invention of the artist. The plaques have easily recognizable subjects: the Crucifixion, the instruments of the Passion, and the risen Christ. The risen Christ on the right is, excuse me, I think I'm right in saying that, is recognizably based on Michelangelo's great statue in Rome in Santa Maria sopra Minerva, of which it is worth noting in passing that Leone Leoni had a full-size cast in his studio in Milan. On the Vienna bust and on the great full-lengths in Madrid, we find a badge of the Virgin Mary. But on the Windsor bust, the choice of the three images seems to me to be representing the triumph of the Catholic faith. I think the use of these badges was probably a prescription of the patron, the Duke of Alba. If we look at his portrait by Titian, I'm sorry this is so dim, but it's a lost portrait, so we have to use this dark copy. It's clear that the crucified Christ appears on his breastplate. I'm not entirely sure how. It seems to be sort of perhaps raised decoration which has been gilded. So we can begin to come to some conclusions as to how the Duke of Alba wanted these three busts to appear to the viewer. They're three musketeers in an identical uniform, all for one and one for all, so to speak. But fundamentally, they're Christian warriors, and more specifically, they're triumphant Catholic warriors. The mission that Charles and Philip propounded and which Alba executed with such deadly effect was the triumph of Catholicism. This lay behind their entire world vision and strategy. And Philip's faith in his own authority from God directed his every action. When, as much as 30 years after this portrait was made, he launched his enterprise on England in 1588, it was in the face of clear strategic advice not to do so. He did it because God told him to do it. I wonder if in today's language it's even permissible to speak of these men as jihadists. They're certainly crusaders. Well, the relationship between the three men was not, perhaps inevitably, quite as strong and consistent as we're being led to believe. The Duke of Alba frequently complained, and it seems entirely justifiably, that he was impoverished rather than enriched by his military service for the empire. And there is a precious document in which Charles V gives his opinion of the Duke of Alba to his son Philip. He wrote as part of a lengthy instruction to his son in 1543, "I feel that the Duke of Alba is of no faction save that which will benefit him. Since it is not good that grandees should enter into the government of the kingdom, I did not let him take part, which he resented very much. In the time that he's been in my service, I've discerned in him great ambition and the desire to rise as high as possible. Take care, son, that he doesn't dominate you. Employ him and honor him and favor him, for he is the best general that we have." Now, the Duke of Alba intended the portraits for the gallery of his castle at Alba de Tormes, not far from Salamanca. What we know about this castle comes from written descriptions alone, for apart from this tower, it was destroyed during the Peninsular War in the early years of the 19th century, a significant fact in our story. But in his book of travels through Spain, published in 1788, to which I referred earlier, Antonio Ponce does give us a glimpse of the interiors of the castle. It was, as you can see, right in the center of the town. One entered through a grand portico into a low gallery hung with paintings of animals. Perhaps They were hunting scenes, let's imagine. And then via a tower decorated in fresco, apparently by Florentine artists, you proceeded into several other rooms hung with paintings by Flemish artists such as Martin de Vos. The subjects included the Congress of the Gods and the history of Moses. Nothing, though, says Pons, was as grand as the armory, both for the arms and armor, but also for the paintings, which represented 3 battles at which the great Duke had served with particular distinction. The armory led into a spacious gallery at the center of the palace, adorned with 6 marble columns and with bronze busts on pedestals. And it is here that we find our 3 Leone portraits. And by 1571, they were joined by the magnificent portrait of the Duke by Jongelink, which is, of course, just outside the door here. So we have a mental picture, albeit partial, of our Duke entertaining his tenants, his peers, and occasionally his royal and imperial masters in these surroundings. Now, Pons was writing 200 years after his death, after Alba's death, and indeed he noted that many of the paintings in the castle were in poor condition by that time. Worse was to come. In November 1809, a French army commanded by Jean Marchand inflicted a heavy defeat at Alba de Tormes on the Spanish forces of the Duke del Parque. The town and the castle were occupied. In 1813, the castle was burnt to the ground. And I haven't really yet got to the bottom of what happened to all the contents at that point. But in a note in the Windsor Castle inventories, we learn that the 3 Leone busts were removed from one of the palaces of Spain by a French officer of distinction. On knowing that the Jongelink bust here at the Frick was for some years in the possession of Marshal Ney, who kept it at his country house near Paris, I spent, I think, several days in the archives in Paris looking at Ney's papers, hoping to find that he had also helped himself to the Leones, but he didn't. But 3 bad days in the archives is better than 3 days almost anywhere else. But my current prime suspect is the cavalry commander, General François-Étienne Kellerman, and if anyone has any evidence to convict him, I would receive it gratefully. Anyway, by May 1825, the busts had crossed the English Channel, where they were to be found in the catalogue of the sale by auction of the spectacular collection of George Watson Taylor, Esquire, a collection that vanished, thanks to his bankruptcy, almost as quickly as it had been formed. The timing of the sale, from the point of view of King George IV, could not have been better, for he was able to purchase 30 lots for Windsor Castle, including several outstanding pieces of French royal furniture, and, of course, the 3 Leone busts. They cost him £189, broken down, as you can see here. George IV deployed his new treasures as part of an amazing parade of great paintings, furniture, and sculpture in the Grand Corridor at Windsor, a vast gallery 550 feet long, which was built around 2 sides of the upper quadrangle of the castle, designed by Geoffrey Wyatville and completed in 1828. You can see here, incidentally, in the part of the corridor that lay closest to the king's apartments, one of our busts. Well, the furnishings of the Grand Corridor were compiled very largely from other parts of the royal collection, as well as being newly purchased. Portraiture, whether in painting or sculpture, was a consistent theme, as the other views of the corridor from the 1840s show. If one looks at the subjects of the portraits, it is apparent that to qualify for admission to the gallery, you generally had to be an ancestor, a friend, or a hero of George IV. But clearly there was another category too, that of defeated foe. This was actually something that rulers did more often than one might imagine. If we think back to that portrait, that dark portrait of the Duke of Alba that we looked at earlier, it belonged to Charles I, and he had it in one of his galleries at Whitehall in the 1630s. Napoleon created at the Tuileries an extraordinary Galerie des Consuls. Great military leaders of all nationalities and times mingled in, I should add, with Napoleon's own marshals in a series of commissioned busts which included great enemy generals of the not-so-distant past. This is a bust by Pierre-Charles Bridon of the Duke of Marlborough, someone whom Napoleon rated very highly, and by a twist of fate, the bust itself was later purchased by George IV, Napoleon's enemy. Now, when George IV was rebuilding Windsor, and for that matter, Buckingham Palace in the 1820s, he was doing so in a spirit of triumph following the defeat of Napoleon. The architecture and the external sculpture of Nash's new Buckingham Palace was all about military triumph. I hope you can just make out on the skyline, sadly no longer with us, they've crumbled away, military trophies on the ancient Roman pattern. Following a great victory, the Roman generals would make a trophy out of the empty armor of their enemies as an offering of thanks to the gods. And in another scene from the triumph of Caesar by Mantegna, Andrea Mantegna, he shows us the triumphant procession of trophies. Now, during the years I've known and thought about these busts, it occurs to me that this essentially rather peculiar format, and one, I should add, that was peculiar to the Hapsburgs, looks rather like one of these martial trophies. The heads, though ideal, are lifelike, with a beating pulse, as it were, and yet they're sticking out of these empty, lifeless armors. There's no body there. You can see through them. Now, of course, you'll protest that is how you make a bronze bust. You use as little of the expensive material as you can. Of course they're not solid. Yet there is something undoubtedly trophy-like about the presentation. Look at the way these sockles work, whether the elaborate allegorical kind in the Vienna version or the simpler kind at Windsor. Are these curious clips on the Windsor bust, are they supporting a man or an armor? These thoughts arose from seeing the busts in the setting of the guard chamber at Windsor, where they've been for at least the last 100 years. And here they're surrounded by actual trophies of armor, perhaps seen to better effect in this 19th century view. George IV, the Duke of Alba, and most especially Philip II, all established armories in their palaces. But I would suggest they were not necessarily created for the same reasons. Alba, as we've heard from Ponce's description, clearly had a room in which his own military achievements were on display in great battle scenes, surrounded by arms and armor. Philip II established the royal armories at Madrid as a sort of dynastic museum. Armor can be the most direct way of preserving someone's memory, and indeed their appearance. One needs only to think of the Greenwich armor of Henry VIII at Windsor, which is of course a great work of art in itself, but it also preserves a record of the king's person, his presence, in a way no portrait could. In his presentation at Madrid of all the armors of his father, Charles V, there is clear evidence that this is what Philip wanted to do, a sort of memorial to his father. Much later, George IV, when Prince Regent, furnished his armory at Carlton House with exquisite pieces of art weaponry combined with the captured weapons of his enemies. It was a giant trophy cabinet. By 1825, when George IV acquired these works, the Hapsburg Empire was dead and buried. Literally so, with the death in 1780 of the last Empress, Maria Theresia, but also in the sense that following the wars against Napoleon, the European order had well and truly changed from anything that any of these three would have recognized or even dreamt of. So I hope this evening you'll have begun to share with me the fascination that these great objects exert, and to realize, as I have done, how works of art that were intended in every way to communicate triumph, power, and victory can, with the passage of time and in different settings, become themselves captives in a foreign land, symbols indeed of someone else's victory. Thank you all very much.
Thank Jonathan very much for the stimulating lecture. And are there any questions from the audience? He'd be happy to answer. Maybe we can we turn the lights up in the room too so I can see? Thank you.
That's always the way I like it. Oh, there is one. Colin, yes. Yes, a civilian with a certain rank. The image of Charles was arranged in connection with a plan to erect a statue of him in Milan, and that's why there were sittings in 1549 in Brussels. And so Leone had the model, and I believe a similar situation arose for the Philip. So the models were there, and the only one that is an original and unrepeated portrait is the Duke himself. There is a payment, which perhaps I carelessly forgot to mention, which I think is from as late as 1559, for not quite enough, actually, from Alva to Leone, which must be the one for these. But so an indication perhaps of how long they took to make. But, this one here.
How much was dictated by Alvarez?
Well, I was looking, I suppose, at the variations that appear between these versions and the others, and the idea that struck me most was he was trying to emphasize their being united in a religious cause by their prominent wearing of those badges, because there's little else that distinguishes them from the other versions, other than stylistic things, not significant things in a way. So one has to just deduce that was his input, that was his commission, that was the effect of his commission.
Since our audience has the opportunity to go look not at the Leonis but at the Jungle, would you mind commenting a little bit on any relationships between those two images, Albert?
They're separated by, 15, 16 years. And I suppose this one, although he's aged a little bit, I think it is an idealized image. I've always felt it was an outstanding thing in its own right, and an outstandingly original thing. Funnily enough, I was looking at it earlier, and you can see trophies, Roman trophies, on his armor in the bust. Some of them strangely collapsed, no doubt thanks to his activities. But it does still have that quality of the empty trophy. That convention is still adopted, but at the same time it's much more realistic, much more lively portrait. Less hieratic. I will take that phrase from Pope Hennessy. I think that sort of strangely still effect is absent completely from this portrait. Yes, I think it. I mean, I think again that is something that is remarkable and presumptuous, let's say, on his part, because frankly, I don't know whether the other two came to his castle to see them. One hopes they did, but in view of Charles's instruction to his son, one wonders what they would have made of that. I don't know, but you would have think there would be some distinction in rank discernible outwardly from those three portraits, but not according to the Duke. He was every bit as good as they were. It's a nice suggestion, and we will we'll talk.
In that light, I think we're all grateful to the Queen for making them so available to Victorian Albert, where they could be studied very beautifully, as Jonathan pointed out. And we're grateful to Jonathan for having explicated them for us so beautifully tonight. So,
Thank
many
you.
thanks.